The morning mist in the Bulgarian highlands clung to the earth as if trying to keep the world asleep a little longer, to protect it from what was coming. You were 12, barely old enough to tether a restless sheep without your father's help, and yet you already knew peace. The tinny music of iron bells hanging from woolly necks, your mother's rough hands shaping bread from dark rye, and the way the air tasted of smoke and milk at dawn. The valley you called home had always been a world unto itself, where stories were told in whispers beside the hearth, or sung in songs older than the language you spoke. That morning should have been like any other. Your mother was kneeling by the clay oven, humming the lullaby she used to sing when you were still small enough to fall asleep against her shoulder. Your father, stern but gentle, watched you scatter grain for the chickens, nodding in quiet approval. But then came the sound that hollowed your bones. Hooves. Not the casual clop of a neighbour's horse, but the thunderous rhythm of organised arrival. Too many. Too fast. Your father went rigid, his face draining of all colour, as though death itself had whispered his name. Your mother straightened, flour-dusted fingers trembling as the sound grew louder, too precise to be a coincidence. The villagers emerged as if pulled by strings into the muddy street, their eyes already glazed with dread. You had never seen the men look so small. Over the rise came the Ottomans. Horsemen in robes that shimmered even in weak morning light, their turbans pristine, their boots polished rather than muddied by the roads they had taken. They looked unreal, like characters from cautionary tales. Yet, they were terrifyingly alive. Scrolls hung at their waists. Some of the soldiers carried thin switches, not for animals, but for people. Everyone understood before a word was spoken. These were the collectors, the agents of Devshirme, the human tax that fed the empire's unquenchable hunger for boys. Not coin, not cattle, but children. Your mother dropped the clay pitcher in her hands. It shattered at her feet, jagged shards mingling with white milk, rushing like spilled blood toward the gutters. She fell to her knees before the approaching officials, crying out in Bulgarian, begging, though you didn't yet understand what she said. They did not stop. They didn't even glance at her. Your father stepped forward, shoulders squared not in defiance, but resignation, murmuring prayers through clenched teeth. One of the officials, a tall man whose beard was streaked with silver and cruelty, unfurled his parchment and walked down the line of villagers as though inspecting a harvest. He stopped in front of you. With a gesture as casual as flicking away dust, he pointed and barked a command. Your heart nearly stopped. Your mother's scream ripped open the sky. Arms clawed around your waist, nails digging deep, desperate to hold you back. But rough hands seized your shoulders and dragged you forward. You kicked once, twice, fighting, though you knew it would do nothing. Resistance was myth. Quickly, a guard wrapped a rope around your wrists, tethering you like a young animal. Someone pressed a wax seal against your sleeve, a mark that meant taken. Honor, one of them muttered in broken Slavic. Serve the Sultan. Grow into greatness. But as they tugged you away, your father closed his eyes. He understood the shaped lie behind those words. No boy came back from this path. Not ever. You were lifted onto a wooden cart with wheels that groaned like the throats of the condemned. Inside, there were other boys already collected from nearby hamlets. Some younger, some older, all stiff with fear. One clutched a small carved icon. Another was so shocked he could only tremble in silence. All around you, mothers wailed. Fathers stood still, paralyzed by the impossible dilemma of protecting one child at the cost of slaughter for all. By the time the cart lurched forward, rolling past the village boundary stones, you realized you had not cried. Not yet. Something inside you had split in silence, buried deeper than tears could reach. You kept your eyes fixed on your mother for as long as you could, even as the distance widened. She ran barefoot after the cart until she stumbled, falling into the dust. You wanted to shout, "I'll come back," but the words died in your throat. Deep down, some part of you already knew the truth. You would never see her again. The cart jostled down the rocky road, moving away from everything you thought was permanent. Your grandfather's stories, your dog's bark, the smell of your mother's stew, your own name spoken with love. Around you, the empire stretched unseen, immense and hungry. The road led south, where mountains gave way to broad plains, where rumors whispered that beyond the horizon lay a city made of gold and stone, filled with domes that touched heaven. You had never imagined going further than the next village fair, yet now your fate was moving faster than your thoughts. One of the guards tossed you a piece of hard bread. Another told you to sleep if you could, for the journey would be long. The boy beside you, skin olive, eyes strange and bright, leaned close and whispered his name was Ivan. Then he shook his head as if correcting himself. Was, he said bitterly. You understood his meaning without explanation. Names belonged to old lives. Ahead lay the place where boys were emptied and refilled into something new, useful and obedient. Night fell, cold and relentless. You shivered under a thin wool cloak, staring at the stars scattered like salt across the black sky. Somewhere out there, your mother might still be awake, crying. You imagined her kneeling by the broken pitcher, scraping the pieces together with shaking hands, praying feverishly to saints who would not intervene. In that moment, the enormity of your loss crashed through you, and you bit your lip to keep from screaming. But no matter how tightly you pressed your teeth together, you could not silence the truth. Childhood was over, not through the slow, natural fading of innocence, but ripped away like skin from bone. The empire had taken you, and tomorrow it would begin the process of turning you into something utterly unrecognizable. You clung to one final thought as sleep finally swallowed you. Remember who you used to be, even if they force you to forget your name. Remember, the cart rattled endlessly, its wooden wheels carving grooves into dirt roads that wound like veins through conquered lands. Each jolt sent sharp pain through your bound wrists and bruised spine, yet you forced yourself to remain alert. The guards rarely spoke. When they did, it was in terse Turkish you didn't yet understand, but tone alone conveyed everything. Impatience, ownership, authority so absolute it didn't need to shout. Around you, the fields rolled past, forests thinning into plains, villages shrinking into specks behind you. By the second dawn, the countryside felt like a dream receding behind a fogged window. You weren't alone in your realization. Ivan had stopped whispering. His lips moved constantly, muttering prayers or curses. You could no longer tell the difference. Another boy, younger than you, cried through the night until his voice cracked and he simply trembled silently, eyes swollen and unfocused. Occasionally, the guards would toss scraps of food and bark an order to drink from a shared flask of water. You all obeyed without question. Hunger and thirst had already begun teaching their brutal lessons. Somewhere past the Danube, the caravans swelled. Boys from Wallachian farms, Greek fishing villages, Serbian highlands. Dozens joined, each new pair of eyes filled with the same stunned terror, quickly replaced by the distant stare of those realizing resistance only delayed suffering. The guards kept everyone separate by rope, like livestock being herded toward market. You remembered your grandfather's stories of ancient kings who sacrificed lambs on altars. Now you understood those stories were metaphors for boys like you. You traveled for weeks. Days blurred under searing sunlight. Nights shivered beneath unexpected frost. Some boys fell sick, coughing blood or collapsing with fever. Any who couldn't rise when shouted at were left behind on the roadside like broken tools. You tried not to look back at their bodies, but vision itself betrayed you. You memorized the shape of each fallen form, a reminder of what would happen if you faltered. Gradually, you learned how to conserve your strength. Chew slowly. Sleep immediately when the cart stilled. Stay silent unless spoken to, and never, ever show fear in your eyes when the guards scanned your face. By the time the distant outline of the Bosphorus first shimmered on the horizon, you had mastered the art of invisible survival. 2 nights before reaching Istanbul, a boy named Nikos, lanky, 14, with the rebellious spark still flickering inside him, tried to escape. You had overheard him planning in hurried whispers, slip away during a storm, run into the woods, find his way north. He believed if he could reach Christian lands, someone would protect him. But the guards knew every thought before it fully formed. When Nikos bolted under cover of rain, 3 mounted men chased him effortlessly. They brought him back, clothes torn, face muddy. In front of every boy, they beat him with sticks until his back split open. His screams rose over the storm until thunder mercifully drowned them. The next morning, he could barely stand, but they forced him upright and tied him to the cart so he couldn't collapse again. He was still alive when you reached Istanbul, but the light in his eyes was gone. That was when you learned your first true rule of the empire. Bravery might preserve your soul, but it would destroy your body. As the caravan drew nearer to Istanbul, something shifted in the atmosphere. The villagers you passed stopped meeting your gaze. They averted their eyes, muttering prayers under their breath, as if witnessing something both sacred and horrifying. Ottoman soldiers adorned with gleaming scimitars joined the procession as escorts. Their uniforms were immaculate. Their horses snorted wild breath into the morning air. These soldiers did not beat the boys. They didn't need to. Their sheer presence radiated a power that made your knees weak, as if to remind you that the empire could summon death simply by existing. And then, at last, came the first gasp of skyline. You saw slender minarets stabbing toward heaven, domes bulbous and shimmering like polished onyx, and walls so wide they looked like mountains carved by divine hands. The city called itself Istanbul, but to you, it might as well have been another planet. Ship masts bristled like forests in the harbour. Smoke curled from 1,000 chimneys. Bells rang from churches that still dared to stand, even as the crescent moon emblem of conquest flew proudly everywhere. One of the guards leaned over to you while the cart rumbled across a stone bridge. He smiled, not kindly, but knowingly. "Now you become something new," he said in thickly accented Slavic. His words struck with more terror than any beating, because even though you didn't know the details, you understood the meaning. You would soon be stripped of everything that marked you as you. As you crossed through the immense gates, crowds lined the streets not to protest, but to watch. Vendors kept selling roasted chestnuts. Fishermen cast nets into glittering water. Children chased each other laughing, while you, bound and filthy, passed by as if invisible. This was an empire so immense that the destruction of childhood was considered routine. Inside the city walls, slave markets operated noisily, but your destination was not among those stalls. Instead, you were taken along serpentine paths, through endless neighborhoods, until the streets grew cleaner, the buildings grander. You smelled jasmine, incense, roast lamb, river mud, horse dung, all of civilization muddled together. And then you saw it, the sprawling palace complex of Topkapi set like a crown above the sea. Its gates glinted with gold leaf. Its walls breathed secrets and power. Beyond those walls, they promised, was your future. Perhaps glory, perhaps education, perhaps death. All you knew with certainty was that you were no longer a village boy. You were a possession being delivered to the beating heart of a world you could not yet comprehend. You whispered to yourself the last words your mother had screamed as you were taken, not because you believed they might come true, but because you could not bear forgetting the sound of her voice. Come home. The cart halted, the gates opened, and your old life ended, for the second and final time. The gates of Topkapi Palace swallowed you whole with a kind of ceremonial indifference. Massive iron-bound doors groaned open as if reciting an ancient script, and you felt something cold and final settle inside your bones. Whatever waited beyond was not meant to be escaped, only survived. You stepped down from the cart alongside the other boys, your legs numb not from fatigue, but from dread so heavy it seemed to anchor your spirit. The courtyard stretched before you like a stage, beautiful and terrifying, lined with cypress trees and marble pavilions that shimmered in sunlight like hallucinations. You could hear distant fountains whispering, laughter somewhere deep inside the complex, and palace servants moving like clockwork, all part of a world that had functioned without you and would continue long after it consumed you. Immediately, officials swarmed like bees. They wore embroidered robes stitched with gold threads, their turbans impossibly white, their eyes razor-bright with calculation. Each boy was inspected one by one, hands cupping chins, fingers prying mouths open to check teeth, cheeks pinched to test youthfulness, limbs pressed and measured as if choosing fine horses rather than human beings. They asked you a question in Turkish. You failed to answer. A slap followed, not brutal, but casual, like a reminder of the hierarchy into which you now belonged. You nodded mutely to everything that followed. Compliance became your only shield. The selection process was meticulous. The most physically strong were moved into a line marked for janissary training, destined to become elite soldiers. Those with delicate features, intelligent eyes, and bodies still pliant with boyhood grace were directed toward a separate gate, the entrance to the Enderun School, a place whispered to produce poets, statesmen, viziers, and things unnamed. When they pointed at you and jerked their chin toward this second path, pride did not stir in your chest. Instead, fear carved deeper, because even without understanding the language, you understood the look they exchanged, the predatory smile measured not in kindness, but in value. As you walked toward the entrance of the palace school, your wrists finally cut free from rope, you thought briefly of running. Just one sprint, into the streets, down to the harbour, onto a ship, gone. But the gates behind you shut, with a sound like destiny sealing shut. Ahead, eunuchs waited. They were tall, composed, impeccably dressed, yet carried a stillness more frightening than any soldier's blade. Their eyes told you everything. We were once you. We survived by becoming something else entirely. Inside, the world changed in an instant. The chaos of the outer courtyard vanished. Now you were surrounded by polished marble floors, towering domes painted in celestial blue and gold, corridors that branched with hypnotic complexity, a labyrinth designed less to impress and more to disorient. Every sense overloaded. You smelled perfume and sweat, incense and freshly scrubbed stone. You heard music drifting from unseen chambers, flutes, drums, zithers, playing melodies that seemed both enchanting and sinister at once. They led you first to the bathhouse, where servants stripped you naked, without ceremony. They scrubbed your skin until it burned, cut your hair short in a style uniform to the palace, and rubbed fragrant oils into your scalp until you smelled no longer like a shepherd's son, but like a cultivated, exotic. When you dared glance at the reflection in a bronze mirror, your breath caught. Gone was the soot-faced village boy. In his place stood a polished, fragile creature you hardly recognized. Eyes too wide, body too thin, expression too stunned to be called your own. Next came clothing. Silk tunics dyed in rich blues and whites, soft slippers, a small cap. You tried to relish the softness against your skin, but it felt wrong, like wearing another person's fate. One eunuch approached with a stern gravity and pressed a hand to your shoulder. "Your name is no longer yours," he said quietly in Turkish, but repeated brokenly in Slavic, so you would understand. "From now on, you are Mehmed. Forget the other." The proclamation felt like a blade through your last tether to home. Your name, spoken by your mother, etched onto your life so thoroughly you believed it permanent, now cut away with a few foreign syllables. You did not argue. Boys who argued here did not last long. You were brought into the dormitory, a long hall lined with narrow beds, each draped in silk that shimmered like water under candlelight. 20 boys already sat silent upon their beds, staring ahead with expressions of practiced neutrality. When you passed them, none made eye contact. They had learned the rules. You would too, soon enough. As night descended, lanterns cast a golden glow that made everything appear deceptively serene. But you heard things. Stifled sobs, whispered conversations in unfamiliar languages, footsteps that approached and lingered just long enough to unsettle before moving on. You crawled beneath your covers. Sleep did not come. Instead, you clutched a hidden splinter of wood you'd broken from the bathhouse door, the last physical reminder of your past, and whispered your true name like a forbidden spell. Outside your window, the Bosphorus glittered with moonlight, and ships drifted like spectres across black water. Somewhere beyond that darkness was the village you came from, the parents who might even now be praying you'd find strength. But inside these walls, another world coiled around you, a world of protocol, punishment, wealth, and secrets. You sensed already that the palace did not merely want your obedience. It wanted to remake your soul. As you finally drifted into feverish half-sleep, one thought followed you into your dreams. Survive, no matter what survival costs. Morning. Inside the palace did not begin with sunlight. It began with commands. Still half asleep and shivering under silk sheets, you were yanked from your dreams by the bellowed orders of eunuchs. The day's first lesson was that in this new life, time no longer belonged to you. Before the sun's first rays crept over the palace walls, you were made to stand in a perfect line with the other boys, barefoot on cold marble, dressed in assigned tunics. The eunuchs' faces were unreadable as they inspected each boy, adjusting posture, fixing collars, correcting the smallest imperfections. Their touch was clinical, but warning enough. Any mistake would be noticed. In the first hours of your education, you were marched through corridors towards the Enderun classrooms. Clutching a slate and chalk, the halls were filled with beauty-tiled walls in mosaic blues, Quranic calligraphy flowing like water across domes, yet it all felt oppressive in its perfection. Inside the classroom, you were introduced to a world of knowledge unfamiliar and vast. Arabic grammar, Persian poetry, Turkish court etiquette, recitation of prayers, mathematical problems that danced across the slate like riddles from a foreign god. The teachers were both scholars and watchdogs. Compliments were rare, punishments exact. In your old life, learning had meant sitting at your father's knee or listening to stories by the fireplace. Here, it meant memorizing, obeying, performing without flaw. You were expected to learn multiple languages, to bow precisely at the correct angle, to never slouch nor speak out of turn. One boy, struggling to recite a line of Persian verse, was rapped sharply on the knuckles. A second mistake earned him isolation in a dark storage chamber for hours. When he returned, his eyes looked older, emptied of rebellion. You silently committed every lesson to memory, not just words and rituals, but the pattern of survival. At midday, you were taken to the music chamber, where tutors guided your fingers over oud strings and santur hammers. The purpose, they said, was refinement to shape you into young men who could serve dignitaries, charm diplomats, impress ambassadors. Yet beneath the elegance of each lesson, you sensed another truth. You were being crafted into prized instruments, not merely to serve, but to please. The real education, however, took place outside the classroom within the palace's shadowed social hierarchy. Boys like yourself were ranked not only by intelligence, but beauty, obedience, charm. Advancement was whispered as the dream, the promise. Do well, and you might be noticed by a vizier. Become a trusted attendant. Rise beyond the dormitories into true power. But you quickly saw what that rise demanded. Older boys who had once stared at the floor now strutted through corridors in finer robes, speaking sweetly to masters. Their smiles were practiced, their words always polished. At night, they returned quietly to the sleeping halls with whispered orders for the younger ones. Fetch, carry, obey. One evening, as you were scrubbing ink pots near the corridor, a boy named Amit, 3 years into palace life, approached. His voice was soft, almost gentle, but his gaze carried something serpentine. "You're new," he said, settling beside you uninvited. You stiffened. He smiled, as if amused by your fear. "You don't yet understand how things work here. I can protect you, teach you, help you advance." His hand rested heavily on your shoulder. You tried not to flinch. "But protection," he whispered, "must be earned." The implication sliced through you with slow, terrifying clarity. He wasn't talking about academic excellence. He was talking about a different kind of currency, your body, your submission, your silence. You had heard uneasy rumors during the march, but now, in the comfort of polished halls, the truth revealed itself more insidiously. Saying no meant punishment, isolation, shaming, and worse. Saying yes meant surrendering the last thing that had not yet been taken from you. Your innocence. That night, you lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Around you, breaths came in uneven patterns, some sobbing quietly into pillows, others whispering in languages you barely recognized. The footsteps of eunuchs and older attendants drifted through the hall, letting you know that even in darkness, you were never truly unwatched. You clutched your thin blanket and weighed impossible choices. Betray your body to survive, or risk obliteration to preserve dignity that might kill you in the end. Boys before you had made both choices, and you had seen how each path destroyed them in different ways. The next morning, you woke with your decision still unmade, but the palace did not care for indecision. Your slate waited. Your lessons resumed. Life in the Enderun was not a feverish nightmare, but a meticulously organized system, so smooth and gilded that even cruelty became routine. Every smile from a tutor, every new silk tunic, every beautiful palace garden whispered the same message. You are lucky to be here. And beneath that glittering lie beat another cold truth. You were being hollowed out and rebuilt into a creature that would serve empire before self. As you recited Arabic verbs in perfect measure, you caught your reflection briefly in a polished silver tray. The boy staring back was cleaner, smarter, more poised than the shepherd's son who had once tracked sheep beneath misty mountains. To anyone else, he might look like a success story, proof of Ottoman splendor. But inside, you felt a fracture deepening, splitting the person you were from the person you were being forced to become. For now, you whispered to yourself, the silent mantra you had forged like armor. So, just survive today. Tomorrow you'll decide how much more of yourself you can afford to lose. Sooner than you expected, the palace stopped feeling like a cage met with open terror and instead became a labyrinth navigated by instinct. Days blurred into a regimented cycle. Dawn prayers, language lessons, mathematics, etiquette, musical instruction, martial training. Each hour tailored to remake you into an ideal servant of imperial power. You began to excel in your studies, not from passion, but sheer strategy. Every correct answer earned a nod instead of an insult. Every flawless recitation made you less visible to those looking for weakness. You learned Arabic faster than expected, devoured Persian epic tales, not for their beauty, but because knowing them impressed your tutors. You adapted. Outwardly, you were becoming everything the palace wanted: disciplined, sharp-minded, deferential. But inside, a quieter rebellion smoldered. You told yourself, learn their tools, but don't let them rewrite your soul. It was during your 3rd month in the Enderun that the true nature of advancement revealed itself. A high-ranking court official, a vizier named Halil Pasha, attended a music demonstration given by selected pupils. You played the oud flawlessly, your fingers trembling only slightly on the strings. After the performance, whispers followed you like perfume. That evening, you were summoned to the administrative chambers, not punished, but noticed. A eunuch informed you that the vizier had expressed interest. Interest could mean mentorship, access to rare books, a path to real influence. It could also mean something else entirely, desire wrapped in silk and authority. You watched as Halil Pasha held your chin that evening, under the guise of examining your posture. His rings gleamed near your jaw. Bright eyes, he murmured in Turkish you barely understood. A quick mind. His smile was practiced, devoid of warmth, and yet everyone around you bowed in gratitude for this honor. You bowed too, because not bowing would have meant disaster. Inside, your stomach twisted, not from flattery, but from the dawning realization that every successful step forward led deeper into danger. Talent here did not save you. It made you more valuable, and thus more vulnerable. In whispers after lights out, you heard the older boys speak about such patrons. Some saw it as destiny, a way of transforming their pain into privilege. Others went silent when asked. There was a boy, 2 beds down, named Farouk. Perhaps 16, once full of laughter. He had risen quickly, noticed early, dressed now in richer colors. He no longer participated in nightly conversations. He walked with a stiffness that had nothing to do with discipline. When the vizier's name passed in hushed gossip, Farouk's eyes flickered with something between horror and resignation. One night, unable to fight the sickness inside you, you spoke to him quietly. He stared at the ceiling a long time before replying. "If you want to survive," he said in a voice made of broken glass, "choose which parts of yourself you're willing to kill. Once you give them away, you never get them back." The next evening, your name appeared again on a list for special lessons. Panic clawed up your throat. But when they led you not to Halil Pasha's wing, but instead to the library, you almost collapsed with relief. There, a stern and brilliant scholar named Muallim Sinan tested your knowledge of astronomy and logic. To your surprise, he seemed disinterested in politics or predation. He cared only for the contents of your mind. He made you read aloud from texts by Avicenna and Al-Farabi, pushed you to calculate star positions using brass astrolabes, and questioned you fiercely on ethics. What is the purpose of knowledge? Can goodness survive corrupt power? These were dangerous questions, but you answered honestly. Perhaps something in your sincerity moved him, or perhaps he saw a different usefulness in intellect. Whatever the reason, Sinan petitioned to become your primary tutor. This adjustment shifted your placement slightly away from the most predatory patrons for now. In the silent sanctuary of the library, surrounded by centuries of science, poetry, law, and philosophy, something began to happen you hadn't expected. Curiosity started to flicker again. For a few weeks, your mind felt alive, not merely as a tool, but as a reminder of why life was worth fighting for. You learned that the Ottoman world contained contradictions. It could produce exquisite art, complex thought, and unimaginable cruelty all in the same breath. You began to file facts like weapons. You vowed one day somehow to wield your education not as an ornament, but as a blade. Still, even under Sinan's protection, you could feel the palace's gaze pressing on your back. Walking through the garden courtyard, where night-blooming flowers perfumed the air, you sensed eyes behind latticed windows. The walls were beautiful, but they were still walls. You whispered again your old name, letting it hover on your breath like a ghost. You could no longer imagine yourself chasing sheep through mist-covered fields. Yet you clung to those memories as lifelines tethering you to a self beneath the mask. You swore a silent oath. I will survive, but I will not forget. Sinan's mentorship elevated you in the eyes of many, but it also placed you squarely under a harsher spotlight. The palace bureaucracy admired excellence the way a falconer admires a well-trained bird, not for its freedom, but for its usefulness. Your progress in languages, sciences, and etiquette soon became the subject of official reports. Eunuchs began addressing you not as boy, but candidate. You were a step closer to power, not escape, and everyone knew that those closest to the throne were also closest to the fire. With promotion came a transfer to a different dormitory, a smaller, more ornate chamber, reserved for advanced students. The beds were fewer, the silk thicker, the windows faced the glittering Bosphorus, and yet the air felt no freer. Beside you slept boys on the cusp of their own transformations, sharp-jawed youths aged 15 to 18, draped in finery, speaking softly in 6 languages, while learning how to bow, converse, flatter, and manipulate. They were no longer villagers. They had become something else entirely, polished fragments of empire. One of them, Qasim, a brilliantly cynical son of a captured Venetian merchant, welcomed you with unsettling honesty. Ambition keeps us alive, he said one night as the moonlight spilled upon embroidered pillows. If you want your suffering to mean something, climb high. Become a vizier. Rewrite the rules. If you can't do that, then stay small and invisible until you rot. His smirk was both invitation and warning. You didn't answer him, but his words lodged in your mind like a blade. The training intensified. Political instructors arrived, drilling you not only in law, but in theatre. How to interpret a sultan's silence, how to flatter a grand vizier without seeming to flatter, how to conceal your thoughts while appearing utterly sincere. You were handed robes dyed deeper, darker colours, a symbol of your rising status. Even your posture changed. Shoulders squared, chin gracefully lowered, fingers held elegantly as you poured tea for high officials during practical diplomacy exercises. Each gesture was a performance. The palace was turning you into an actor who no longer needed a script. You would have lost yourself entirely had it not been for brief, forbidden moments of rebellion. Late at night, when the lanterns dimmed, you sometimes climbed silently onto the rooftop and whispered old songs from your village into the wind. Beneath you stretched the imperial city, a shimmering maze of lights and rooftops, mosques and shadowy alleys. Somewhere down there, you told yourself, people still lived lives untouched by palace cruelty. You inhaled the salt air of the strait and imagined that the wind might someday carry you back to that simpler world. Yet even rebellion held its dangers. One evening, while you lingered too long by the dormitory door after lights out, a high-ranking eunuch caught you. His face was impassive as he stepped forward. Instead of punishing you himself, he delivered a message in a whisper that chilled your marrow. "Halil Pasha still speaks your name," he said. "Be careful whose interest you attract." That night, you tried to sleep, but the silk sheets felt like a net tightening around you. You thought of Farouk, of vanished Nikos, of boys whose faces you remembered more vividly than your mother's. You realized that survival required more than endurance. It required strategy. You could not rely on Sinan forever, nor on fleeting kindness. If you were to endure the next phase, you would need power of your own. The palace offered only two paths: become prey, or evolve into something more dangerous. At 16, the older students began receiving assignments outside the palace walls: envoy tasks, clerical duties, even spy work. You watched them leave through inner gates with expressions too complex to read. Some carried hope. Others carried scars so deep they no longer resembled emotions. Each departure reminded you, the Enderun was not a sanctuary, but a forge, heating and hammering you into a tool meant to serve imperial ambitions. One night, while polishing your slippers by candlelight, you overheard two eunuchs discussing candidates for favored attendant at the Sultan's next banquet. Your name was mentioned casually, alongside Qasim's and another boy called Omer. The title carried prestige, but also risk of becoming visible in ways you dreaded. You realized then that your future would not be decided by what you wanted, but by how well you could bend destiny to your advantage while appearing utterly compliant. When morning came, you knelt in prayer like the others, spoke flawless Arabic verses, and bowed so gracefully the eunuchs nodded with pride. Yet inside, your heartbeat thrummed with a secret vow. If this palace thinks it can devour me whole, then I will change from meat into poison. The banquet preparations unfolded with precision so ornate, it made ordinary life seem like a faded memory. Courtyards were draped in brocade, musicians tuned their instruments with trembling focus, and the kitchen fires roared from dawn until dusk. Servants moved like ants bearing precious cargo platters of lamb studded with pomegranate seeds, sherbets in crystal cups, gold trays filled with sugared rose petals and jeweled fruits. To an outsider, it would appear a celebration of unmatched splendor. But to you, and to every palace boy chosen to serve that evening, it felt like approaching the edge of a glittering blade. Your robe was embroidered freshly for the event, its dark green silk capturing candlelight, in a way that made you look older and more refined than your 17 years. Sinan, your teacher, adjusted your collar and met your eyes with rare softness. "Remember what you are here for," he whispered, not as a command, but a lifeline. You nodded, though you doubted even he understood the storm inside your chest. When the guests arrived, viziers, judges, foreign ambassadors, favored poets, the air thickened with perfume and power. You served silently, pouring sherbet into delicate cups, offering bowls of steaming stew, bowing so perfectly that none could fault you. Patrons appraised you the way collectors might examine rare artifacts at the bazaar. You learned to keep your gaze low without looking defeated, to remain composed even when unwanted hands brushed your sleeve or chin, to transform your fear into something that looked like grace. Halil Pasha was among the guests. You felt his presence before you saw him. He moved through the hall like a lion among doves, confident and idle. When his gaze landed on you, it stayed too long. A smile ghosted across his lips. You bowed, carefully and quickly. He murmured your name, your new name, as if savoring it. You avoided shivering only by digging your nails into your palms so hard they drew blood. Qasim, standing a few feet away with a wine jug, gave you the tightest flicker of a glance, as though reminding you, choose your moves wisely, or you will become a story boys whisper about in terror, long after you're gone. The moment of most danger arrived when Halil beckoned you forward with a single finger. Pour. You stepped forward, hands steady, even though your heart slammed like a war drum. As you refilled his cup, he lifted your chin with the back of his hand. You learn quickly, he said. I appreciate potential. His thumb slid along your jawline, a gesture that looked innocent to onlookers, but promised something darker. Your mind raced. Say too little and seem dull. Say too much and seem eager. The wrong reaction might destroy you. So you did what you had been trained to do, turned the moment into a performance. You met his gaze for a heartbeat, offered a smile smooth as glass, and replied in crisp Turkish, "It is my greatest honor to serve the Empire with every gift I possess." You bowed so elegantly, other guests nodded in approval, mistaking survival for devotion. Halil chuckled low in his throat, a sound that threaded anticipation with amusement. Yes, I see the future will be interesting. But when he turned away, you released a breath so careful it was nearly invisible. You had won this round, but you could feel how close you stood to disaster. Near midnight, as lamps flickered low and instruments softened into lullaby tones, your duties ended. You retreated to the servants' corridor on shaky legs, heart bruised from the effort of appearing untouched. There, in the shadows, Qasim appeared beside you. He did not speak at first. Instead, he handed you a cloth to wipe the blood from your palm. When you looked at him with confusion, he said quietly, "Tonight you learned the most important skill of survival here, how to let them believe they own you, while remaining yours alone inside." You pressed the cloth over your hand and nodded, more grateful than you could ever admit aloud. Beyond the corridor doors, the banquet continued with laughter and wine, but you were soon escorted back to your dormitory chambers. You collapsed onto your silk sheets, body exhausted, but mind racing with new calculations. Yes, you had survived the banquet without becoming one man's toy, but your increasing visibility meant something else. Some high circle in the palace now considered you a piece worth moving. You were no longer simply reacting to their games. Whether you liked it or not, you were being drawn into them. Before sleep overtook you, you prayed not to return home. You no longer believed that possible, but for the strength to twist the system to your own purpose. One day, perhaps, you would shape the empire as it had tried to shape you. One day, your name, your true one, might echo not as a captive, but as a master of fate. But first, you whispered beneath your sheets, you must endure. One more day, one more test, one more transformation. Your rise within the palace was not marked by celebration, but by subtle shifts, noticeable only to those who'd learned to read the Empire's silent language. You were moved to a chamber closer to the administrative wing and upgrade, spoken of as an honor, but understood to mean you were now under closer watch. Your food improved, your lessons grew more advanced, and your new duties placed you nearer to power. Yet none of these changes gave comfort. Instead, they confirmed your deepest suspicion. You were being groomed for something beyond the school's walls, something that required not just intelligence, but obedience wired into your very bones. You watched the boys around you respond to similar pressures in wildly different ways. Dmitri, once a scrawny, terrified child from a village not far from your own, had blossomed into a favorite among several high-ranking officials. He laughed easily, danced when asked, and flirted with a polished bravado that suggested his soul had been traded for survival long ago. He now wore velvet and silver, moving with the elegance of a courtier. Yet behind his eyes, you saw emptiness so total, it frightened you more than punishment ever could. Stephanos, by contrast, a Greek fisherman's son with a stubborn streak, resisted every expectation placed upon him. He performed his duties mechanically, refused interaction beyond the absolute minimum, and endured repeated punishments with quiet defiance. Over time, those punishments wore him down. His eyes dulled, his back bowed ever so slightly. One morning, his bed was found empty. No one spoke his name again. You were left to wonder if he was reassigned to a remote province or simply removed in a way that left no record. The palace did not like unanswered questions. It erased them. Between Dimitri's eager embrace and Stephanos's doomed rebellion, you forged your own path. A delicate balance, compliant, diligent, slightly ambitious, but never too ambitious. You learned to influence without appearing to. You assisted favoured tutors, corrected younger boys' homework without being asked, spoke only when confident your words would be well received. When unjust blame floated toward you, you accepted it with humility instead of resistance. You discovered that in the palace, power did not always belong to those who shouted. It belonged to those who listened, remembered, and waited. Still, moments came when the mask slipped. During fencing lessons in the courtyard, when you clashed blades with other students, something feral would burst from your chest rage mixed with desperate will. Your instructor praised your skill, not realizing it wasn't skill driving you, but survival instinct disguised as grace. At night, when you helped prepare reports for officials, your pen scratched furtively across parchment as you copied letters you knew might one day decide the fate of men and provinces. You touched those documents gently, thinking, "One day, I must control the hand that writes such words, not merely obey it." It was this combination of competence and restraint that caught the attention of Shehzade Murad, a royal prince known among the palace for his sharp wit and unpredictable moods. When word reached you that he had requested your presence to assist with his correspondence, you felt again that sick lurch of destiny pulling you forward. A prince's notice could launch you to greatness or destroy you so thoroughly no one would dare mention your name. On the appointed day, you were escorted to his private study, where the scent of musk and ink mingled. The prince was young, only a few years older than you, but already radiated the coiled confidence of someone born to command. He looked you over as though assessing whether you were a new instrument or a potential liability. When he spoke, his voice carried both boredom and threat. "They say you are clever and discreet," he said, letting a quill roll between his fingers like a dagger. "I need someone I can trust. I reward loyalty and punish disappointment." He handed you a stack of letters, some in crude cipher, others in Turkish, Persian, and Arabic. Your task was to copy them perfectly, translate where necessary, and prepare scripted replies. You bowed, promised absolute diligence, and began. Hours blurred as you worked. Your mind raced not only with ink and language, but with the question of what secrets you now held in your hands. Alliances, debts, bribes, betrayals. When finished, you presented the letters with your head lowered. Murad studied your work, then smiled a smile so slight it barely existed. You may be useful after all. That night, as you returned to your dormitory, a eunuch handed you a new robe, a finer one. His Highness was pleased, he said. You relaxed just enough to breathe, but not enough to let your guard fall. You knew now that your fate was tied to a prince whose whims could lift or end your life in a heartbeat. You lay awake, staring up at the curved ceiling painted with stars and flowers, so beautiful you could almost forget you were a captive. The wind carried the sound of distant waves from the Bosphorus. With each breath, you reminded yourself why you endured this corruption, why you played your role so carefully. Because beneath every humiliation, you were gathering strength. Because one day, perhaps, you might turn everything you learned here against the throne itself. You whispered a final promise into the darkness. I will not merely survive you. I will outlive you. I will outgrow you. I will someday outmaneuver you all. While palace life felt all-consuming from the inside, you slowly became aware of another world watching from beyond its walls. Foreign ambassadors, Venetians, Frenchmen, Habsburg envoys visited the court with ornate gifts and guarded curiosity. They dined under gilded ceilings, entertained by music and spectacle. But beneath their diplomatic smiles, they whispered rumors of cruelty, decadence, and secrets hidden in silk. Some of them kept diaries. Others sent reports back to Europe. Through their eyes, your life was distorted into an exotic spectacle. One afternoon, as you carried documents through a mosaic-lined corridor, you overheard two such envoys debating in rapid Italian. One murmured that the palace boys were as beautiful as Greek statues and as tragic as cursed souls. Another claimed the Ottoman system transformed savage captives into polished instruments of empire. They spoke as if you were an object, something aesthetic and mysterious, never imagining you could understand their words or feel the sting behind them. Later, in the library, you found actual accounts written by visiting Europeans. Sinan discreetly encouraged you to read them, not as praise, but as a lesson in perception. A 16th century Venetian ambassador described pages with eyes like frightened doves, trained like hounds to obey their masters. He wrote of how officials fondled them with a fondness that veered toward the unnatural. But he also compared the palace education to the finest academies in Florence or Padua, calling it a marvel of civilization built upon barbaric foundations. These contradictions mirrored your own existence. A French envoy's journal, more explicit, wrote of a reception where boys, dressed in silks, moved among the powerful like birds in gilded cages, their downcast eyes hiding a terror that bleeds through their delicate smiles. He confessed that he left the palace feeling unsettled, as if I had witnessed something both magnificent and monstrous. You realized then how little outsiders truly understood. They saw only glimpses, a lavish banquet, a fleeting gesture of inappropriate familiarity. Yet they sensed the undercurrent of something darker. For them, it was a shocking curiosity. For you, it was everyday life. The palace had mastered appearing glorious while concealing its cruelty in plain sight. You wondered bitterly whether the world would ever care enough to look past the silk. Still, these foreign perspectives gave you a strange, unexpected kind of strength. If others could see the palace's cracks, even imperfectly, then perhaps the system was not invincible. Perhaps one day, truth could bleed through the gold leaf. You tucked those notions deep inside, next to your oldest memories. Enemies, too, were watching. Persian spies, European rivals, rebellious Balkan nobles. One rumor buzzed quietly among the highest circles, a movement stirring along the Danube, where Christian uprisings whispered of revenge against the Devshirme and dreams of liberation. You clung to this knowledge secretly, letting it warm the part of you still loyal to the boy you once were. Somewhere, perhaps, parents spoke your name in hope rather than mourning. Your own role slowly expanded further into espionage. Shehzade Murad trusted your talent with languages, and soon you were asked not only to translate his letters, but to decode intercepted messages, notes confiscated from suspected traitors, letters written in cryptic ciphers by European agents bribing Ottoman officials. You learned to read between the lines, how a poem could be a threat, how a proverb could conceal instructions for revolt. This skill made you invaluable, but also dangerous. One mistake could brand you disloyal. One secret too many might mark you for silent elimination. Qasim warned you one evening as you both silently polished the silver in preparation for a new ambassador's arrival. Information is the most powerful weapon here, he said without looking up. It can raise you higher than any sword and bury you faster than any blade. You nodded, gripping your cloth tighter. You understood that your survival now lay in mastering not only the arts of submission and intelligence, but of silence. Knowledge was power, yes, but spoken carelessly, power could become a death sentence. Months passed. You watched ambassadors come and go, their interpretations of palace life shaped by their own culture and imagination. Some saw perversion, others saw civilization. Few saw the boys, truly saw them, as human beings caught in a machine that was both exquisitely beautiful and systemically cruel. You began to wish, almost feverishly, that one day someone would write not of your silk garments or obedient posture, but of your heart, still beating, still remembering. For now, you continued your dance inside the empire's most magnificent illusion. You bowed to princes, translated treason hidden in lullabies, and smiled when spoken to, even when you wanted to scream. The world might not know the truth yet, but you were beginning to understand how to carve your own path through it. One calculated move at a time. Life in the palace was a precisely engineered blend of refinement and control, where beauty masked brutality so thoroughly that you often wondered if anyone outside its walls could comprehend the cost at which excellence was achieved. From dawn to midnight, every moment of your existence was regulated not merely to educate you, but to break you into a new shape, malleable, elegant, and unquestioning. The day began well before sunrise. You were shaken awake by eunuchs, instructed to wash, dress, and head to morning prayer. The Arabic verses rolling across your tongue so fluidly now that even you sometimes forgot you once spoke another language. Next came breakfast, bowls of spiced porridge, olives, flatbread, each portion measured not for nourishment, but control. You learned quickly never to complain. Complaints courted suspicion, and suspicion was the first step toward erasure. Lessons followed one after another with military precision. Mathematics and astronomy in the sun-washed rooms overlooking the sea. Law and rhetoric in chambers lined with ancient scrolls. Sword practice in courtyards swept so clean they glimmered like mirrors. In these moments, you sometimes caught your reflections stomping forward with perfect poise. A young man who could debate Aristotle in Greek, calculate planetary orbits, and bow at exactly 17 degrees to higher officials. And you barely recognized yourself. Yet beneath that intellectual glory lay a strict regime of discipline designed to squash any sprout of dissent. Boys who slipped into their native languages were forced to kneel for hours on bare stone, repeating Turkish proverbs until their tongues numbed. Those who hesitated to obey were struck with thin rods, not to injure visibly, but to humiliate. Even minor failures, incorrect posture, a clumsily tied sash, resulted in public reprimand. You witnessed a boy named Milos, once quick-witted and proud, caught whispering a Christian prayer under his breath. He was dragged into the courtyard, stripped naked, and made to stand there all day while other students passed him with carefully blank faces. You felt yourself flinch inside, not just for his pain, but for the knowledge that such shame was contagious. The palace wanted you to believe your former identity was a sin. The strategy worked. One by one, Boys stopped referring to their pasts altogether. Traditions vanished. Languages faded. You could see the palace like a grinding wheel, filing away everything unique until only polished copies remained. Some boys cried themselves silently to sleep. Others hardened into ambition, competing ruthlessly for tutor approval and prestige. The system rewarded such hunger. Exceptional students received privileges, softer beds, better food, access to books forbidden to others. You learned to desire these privileges not for comfort, but for protection. You notice the way favor changed everything. Boys with power ate more, smiled more, grew stronger over time. Those without diminished, shoulders shrinking inward, eyes growing dim. Privilege made survival easier, and therefore more addictive. Even you found yourself thrilled when a eunuch handed you a ripe quince as a reward for your flawless composition. You tasted its sweetness and cursed how quickly your heart felt grateful. Escapes were rare and nearly always doomed. Yet occasionally, a boy would try, scaling a low wall, disguising himself as a servant, attempting to slip away during market days. Those caught suffered gruesome punishments, meant not just to wound, but to warn. One afternoon, a boy who attempted to swim across the Golden Horn was dragged back, half drowned. The eunuchs beat him in front of the dormitories so severely his spine twisted. He lived, but barely, kept alive as a breathing monument to futility. You passed him daily, whispering inside your own skull, "Don't run, endure." As survival turned into a kind of art, you became adept at reading the unspoken rules. Never criticize anyone above you. Never refuse a task. Never show disgust or fear. If an older student offered protection in exchange for favors, know how to refuse so politely it didn't sound like a refusal. Or know when to accept if the alternative was worse. You witnessed alliances forged in whispers, boys promising loyalty to each other, forming quiet cabals in corners of the library, trading warnings, which tutor to avoid at nightfall, which path through the garden remained darkest after midnight. Your own alliance with Qasim deepened. "We will not survive alone," he told you during one ritual bath where he spoke barely above the splash of water. "Watch my back. I will watch yours." It was a fragile ritual of trust in a place built on betrayal. But somehow, against your better judgment, you believed him. For the first time in years, you felt less alone. That night, as you lay in your bed tracing with your finger the invisible grooves of the wooden frame, you reflected on how far you had travelled from your village, and how far yet you might rise or fall. You reminded yourself, yet again, the palace wants to turn you into something less than human. To win, you must become something more. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of forced obedience and learned refinement, you kept alive a hidden ember, the scorching belief that you were meant not just to endure history, but to shape it. As the years ground forward, the palace worked hard to convince you that cruelty and luxury were not contradictions, but companions. Now approaching adulthood, you had grown tall, lean, eyes sharpened, not only by study, but by the constant vigilance required of those who wish to live. You had become something remarkable, a boy who could quote Persian poetry, navigate delicate diplomatic etiquette, smile with perfect courtesy, while secretly appraising every person in the room as either threat, shield, or stepping stone. Within this ecosystem of fear, an invisible market operated, favors traded for protection, secrets for advancement. The smallest indulgence held worth greater than gold. A fresh orange, a private book from the inner library, a thicker blanket during winter, such items became currency. Boys competed, bargained, begged, or bribed for them. The palace's genius lay in denying nothing openly while making everything quietly scarce, ensuring your desires would always keep you bound. You learned how to cultivate relationships, not of friendship, but of utility. With one eunuch, you spoke reverently of duty until he granted you library access. With another, you played up fear and humility so he would warn you in advance when Halil Pasha prowled the corridors at night. You helped Qasim ghostwrite love poems in Arabic for a patron he sought to impress. He in return taught you the subtleties of genealogy and court scandals that might one day save your life. Beneath the polished rituals, you and your peers behaved more like gamblers, playing a rigged game, than students pursuing honor. The most powerful ally, however, remained knowledge. As Shehzada Murad increasingly relied on you to decipher coded messages and draft sensitive correspondence, you became privy to a dangerous level of detail. You learned of rogue governors skimming tax revenue, of janissary captains plotting dissent, of European courts bribing officials with silk, wine, and illicit promises. These were secrets that could elevate you into a trusted advisor or condemn you to drowning should your loyalty ever be questioned. One evening, Murad summoned you to his chambers. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting his face in flickering gold. He did not smile as he handed you a thin letter with an unfamiliar seal. "This is from my brother's faction," he said quietly, referring to royal rivalries so serious that a single spoken rumor could spark imprisonment or execution. "Translate it. But do not leave this room." You nodded, heart pounding. You spent hours combing each ornate phrase for hidden meaning. When you placed your transcription on the table, Murad studied you with an intensity that froze your breath. Finally, he reached into a small chest and withdrew a chain bearing a delicate gold medallion. "You have served me well," he said. "Wear this, and others will know you are under my protection." He fastened it around your neck himself. You bowed so low your forehead brushed the carpet. But inside, cold calculation turned. His gift was a collar no different than those put on prized animals. You would be safe, yes, but only as long as you remained useful. Back in your quarters, Qasim stared at the medallion with an unreadable expression. "Congratulations," he said softly. "You are now officially someone's property with privileges." His words stung more than they should have. You considered ripping the chain off, but you didn't. Protection, even under a prince, was still protection. Word of your proximity to power traveled quickly. Doors that had once remained closed now cracked open. Tutors deferred slightly when speaking to you. Younger boys watched with a mix of admiration and envy, whispering rumors that you were destined for something greater, perhaps even a place in the Imperial Council once your education was complete. You managed your expressions carefully, humble, diligent, grateful. But inside, another transformation stirred. You began to believe you might actually reach high enough to change the palace rather than be crushed by it. Yet such ambition carried consequences. Favored boys became targets. One night, you discovered a note slipped under your pillow, made from delicate paper, written in cryptic Greek. "Remember your real name. The Balkan winds still whisper revolt." Your hands trembled. Was it from a fellow captive, encouraging rebellion? Or was it a trap, a test of loyalty? You burned the note over your candle, breathing in the smoke as if consuming your past. Quietly, you strengthened your alliances, sharpened your mind, and reminded yourself daily. Trust no one completely. Not even Qasim, not even Murad, not even your own desperate desire for power. In the palace, survival depended not on strength alone, but on anticipation. You had to stay 2 steps ahead of enemies and 3 steps ahead of friends. Late one night, As you traced a finger over the medallion at your throat, you whispered your strategy into the dark. I will climb so high, they will never dare throw me down. And once I reach the summit, I will expose everything these walls hope to hide. As you matured inside the imperial system, the line between survivor and collaborator began to blur in ways that haunted even your dreams. You were no longer just a boy enduring cruelty. You were becoming a man to whom others bowed. Your education neared completion, and the palace started testing you in more calculated ways, placing you in real-world scenarios where your choices carried consequences not just for yourself, but for others. Shehzada Murad increasingly entrusted you with sensitive missions under the guise of practical training. Once, he sent you to observe a meeting between palace officials and a rebellious governor from Anatolia. You stood silently by the wall, translation scroll in hand, while watching men decide the fate of provinces with smiles sharp as blades. You learned how to spot false flattery, how to weigh threats disguised as poetry, how to remain expressionless when hearing decisions that would bring suffering to hundreds. On the return journey, Murad asked for your opinion. You answered cautiously, with calculated honesty. He laughed, pleased. You will go far, he said, or die young. You thought of your village, your mother's face fading now, even in memory. You had not died, but neither were you fully alive. Back in the Enderun, it became impossible to ignore the transformation of your peers. Boys once full of innocence now strategized over whom to please, whom to betray, which patron would grant the fastest rise. Some, like Qasim, embraced their roles with ruthless clarity. Others masked their ambition under smiles so sweet they rotted their souls. And some, oh some, became exactly like the men who once tormented them. One evening, you found Dmitri, that once village boy with a hollow smile, pressing a younger student against the dormitory wall, whispering the same predatory promises older boys had once whispered to him. The panic in the child's eyes split your heart open, not because you were shocked, but because you were not. You intervened quietly but firmly, pulling Dmitri away under the guise of a task from the tutors. He smirked at you, eyes dead. Don't pretend you're still pure, he hissed. We all become them eventually. His words echoed inside you, long after he walked off, adjusting his silk cuffs. That night, you couldn't sleep. You stared at the ceiling, wondering whether survival within the system inevitably meant becoming its enforcer, whether power was poisoning your intentions drop by drop. You had once sworn to remember your true name as Resistance, but now, even that name felt strange in your mind, as though it belonged to a boy already half dead. In the weeks that followed, the final trials approached, a series of exams, rituals, and evaluations that would determine your placement in imperial service. Some would be sent to distant provinces as administrators, others into the military as commanders, others still into the palace bureaucracy. This was the moment you had been forged for, the moment your suffering was meant to bear fruit. Yet instead of relief, you felt only dread. Because success meant stepping fully into a role you had spent years trying to survive, not become. Before your first final interview, you visited the palace baths. There, in thick steam scented with musk and citrus, you found yourself alone with Sinan, your old tutor, now grey-haired, his eyes still sharp. He studied you for a long time before speaking. I once believed brilliance could save boys like you, he said quietly. Now I'm not sure if I saved you, or helped the palace devour you more efficiently. You wanted to comfort him, but the words wouldn't come. Because wasn't it partly true? Your mind had allowed you to rise, but at what moral cost? Sinan touched your shoulder gently. If you obtain power, he whispered, Remember the boy you were, and protect those who have no protection. You nodded, throat tight. That night you prayed, not to escape, but not to lose whatever shred of humanity still pulsed in your chest. When the trials began, you performed flawlessly. You answered questions on law with eloquence, solved mathematical proofs with ease, recited poetry that made even jaded judges nod. You demonstrated fencing technique with lethal precision and translated a diplomatic insult so tactfully the examiner had to conceal a smile. At the end, a vizier announced your placement. Imperial Administrative Service, under the direct supervision of the prince. It was the highest honor any graduate could hope for. The students around you clapped politely. Kasim leaned in to whisper, "You've won." But as you bowed and accepted the scroll declaring your appointment, you realized it felt less like a triumph and more like a chain forged of silk and blood. You had not broken the palace. You had not escaped it. You had become one of its sharpest tools. That night, laying awake with the medallion glinting softly against your chest, you whispered into the dark, "Then let me become the kind of tool that can eventually turn back against the hand that wields it." The graduation ceremony, called Chukma, was designed not to celebrate you, but to transform you publicly from student into servant of empire. It began before dawn, with ritual ablutions meant to purify everything you had been before, your name, your origins, your memories. Dressed in ivory silk stitched with imperial gold thread, you stood alongside the other selected graduates in a courtyard that smelled of jasmine and fear. Trumpets blared softly as officials, tutors, and eunuchs observed you like craftsmen admiring their finest weapons before dispatching them to battlefields invisible to outsiders. When your name, Mehmed of the Enderuns, was called, you stepped forward. A silver-headed staff touched your forehead. Words of blessing were recited. And then it was announced. You were appointed to the imperial bureaucracy as personal secretary and aide to Shehzade Murad, soon expected to rise higher, perhaps even to divan, council rank. Applause rippled through the courtyard. To anyone watching, you were living proof of Ottoman excellence, a conquered boy turned into a polished imperial jewel. Inside, however, a quiet horror spread. Your years of captivity had not been an ordeal you escaped. They had been training you to perpetuate the very system that had broken you. By afternoon, you were escorted out of the familiar school wings and into Murad's administrative residence, another palace within the palace. Here, luxury reached suffocating extremes. Carpets woven from silk so soft your feet sank like they were stepping into water. Low tables piled with pearls and emerald boxes. Incense smoke curling in gold filigree braziers. Servants dressed you now, not as a student, but as a court official. Robes dyed with imperial purple, a thin ruby ring bearing Murad's personal emblem, boots imported from Persia. You felt as though you were being wrapped in chains disguised as privilege. Your duties began immediately. You managed the prince's confidential archives, routing letters to spies in Wallachia, governors in Rumelia, merchants along the Silk Road. You drafted responses sprinkled with subtle intimidation, weaving threats into poetry with such elegance that recipients thanked you even as they trembled. Murad no longer referred to you as boy. He called you my falcon, a creature admired for its sharp beak and fierce loyalty, even though it hunts at another's command. Some nights, when high-level negotiations stretched late, you were present not as servant, but as shadow. There, between the flicker of oil lamps and clink of crystal goblets, you watched the most powerful men of the empire trade lands, favors, marriages, and sometimes bodies. Patrons selected boys from the palace the way one might select tapestries. You stood silent as jokes were made about a young graduate's obedient beauty. Some officials even asked Murad if your talents extended beyond translation. The prince smiled and replied in a voice that froze your blood. He belongs to me. Possession from the mouth of a prince protected you from other wolves, and yet it confirmed that you were never truly free. Promotion brought wealth too, an allowance of coins, your own small suite of rooms, and even a young servant assigned to serve you. The boy, barely 13, knelt at your feet the first day, eyes wide with the same terror you once carried. You struggled for breath, recognizing yourself inside him. His name was Elias, taken from a village in Epirus. When he whispered, "What must I do to survive here?" you heard your past echo into the present. You made a choice. You told him in a low, steady voice, "Learn everything. Trust no one completely. And when the time comes, remember not to become what they want you to be." In that instant, you realized a terrible truth. As long as you remained inside this glittering cage, your very existence could either replicate its cruelty or subtly undermine it. For the first time, you did not just endure the palace. You began using your position to protect, slipping extra food to Elias, diverting attention away from younger boys when predatory patrons looked too closely, rerouting assignments so the vulnerable landed in safer positions. Each act tiny, almost invisible, but real. At night, you contemplated your future. Many Enderun graduates rose to become viziers, military commanders, governors. They carried their trauma like hidden knives. Some used it to enforce harder discipline across the empire. Others drank themselves, numb, in provincial palaces, haunted by memories. You were determined that if you were to rise at all, it would be to reshape the system from within, even if that meant living a lie day after day. You knelt in prayer one evening, not out of devotion, but because the posture gave you time to think. You whispered not to God, but to your 12-year-old self, that boy stolen on a misty morning. "We haven't won yet," you told him silently, "but we haven't lost either." As the night wind rattled the lattice screens of your luxurious new chamber, you touched the ruby ring Murad had given you, and promised yourself that someday it would not be a symbol of submission, but of transformation. Even if it took a lifetime, historical change does not arrive like thunder. It creeps, almost imperceptibly, beneath the surface of splendor, and even within the mighty Ottoman palace, the system that had shaped and scarred you was beginning to show strain. Whispers of discontent filtered across silk curtains, carried by diplomats, merchants, and spies. Murmurs that the Janissary Corps, once invincible, had grown unruly and corrupt. That European cannons were outmatching Ottoman cavalry. That the world outside the palace was shifting, with or without the empire's consent. Inside the court, however, life continued in practiced opulence. Ceremonies were held as magnificently as ever. Eunuchs still bowed with perfect precision, and boys still arrived from distant villages, unaware they were walking into gilded captivity. But you noticed the cracks. A tutor mentioning budget cuts for certain lessons. A prince whispering his concern about European influence. A vizier arguing longer than usual over military stipends. You, now positioned close to these rooms, listened carefully. Knowledge remained your greatest weapon. The change wasn't only political. Slowly, there came questions from within society itself. Scholars debating whether the Devshirme system was truly righteous. Poets writing veiled critiques comparing palace acquisition of boys to orchards stolen from another man's soil. Some ulama, religious scholars, argued the practice had strayed from its noble origins, becoming more about exploitation than service. Still, Tradition was powerful. Most looked away, preferring beautiful myths over ugly truths. Meanwhile, as European powers like Austria and Russia expanded, they began organizing diplomatic condemnations of Ottoman practices they once only whispered about. Pamphlets circulated in Venice, Paris, Vienna, calling the palace system barbaric. The Ottomans, offended, dismissed these as hypocritical propaganda, but the pressure grew, especially as Ottoman military setbacks increased doubts at home. You understood. The empire would not end suddenly, but it was tilting, and those at the top were becoming more desperate to maintain control. In the palace halls, a subtle paranoia took hold. Surveillance intensified. Eunuchs questioned servants more often. Letters were checked twice before being sent. And even high officials muttered that loyalty is weakening. Your work for Murad grew more sensitive. He trusted you now with counter-spying, drafting instructions to agents to root out dissent among governors, janissaries, even among palace officials themselves. It unsettled you that you had become central to strengthening the very machine you hated, even as you used your growing influence in secretive ways to soften some of its cruelties. It was during these years that young Elias, the boy you had quietly mentored, came of age within the school. You watched him grow sharper, stronger, but because of your subtle interventions, less broken than others. He whispered to you one evening after delivering papers, "I will never forget I was taken, but I will choose what I become." His determination rekindled something in you that had been dangerously close to dying. Belief that resistance was possible, even if slow and hidden. Beyond the palace walls, rebellions occasionally flared in the Balkans. Small villages, like the one you came from, rose up only to be put down with ferocity. Reports came across your desk. When no one watched, you traced a trembling finger over the names of towns. Sometimes, you smuggled warnings to Elias, which areas boys were currently being taken from, urging him to memorize them. Imagine a future where, should the empire falter, he might help stop the seizures from happening at all. Change abroad continued. The Enlightenment was spreading across Europe. Ideas of natural rights and childhood innocence began to circulate even within the writings of Ottoman intellectuals. A few dared ask, should the empire truly build its glory on the backs of stolen children? Most were silenced, some disappeared, but the fact that the question was being asked at all meant the world had begun to awaken. Still, within the marble walls of Topkapi, golden lamps glowed as bright as ever. Wines were poured, poems recited. Boys still served delicately spiced sweets to men who never asked the price of those smiles. Some mornings, you woke in your fine bed, aching with the contradiction of it all. A man, once a victim, now an official. Once powerless, now holding power to harm or help at a whim. You reminded yourself daily that survival was never enough, that your mission had changed, no longer merely enduring, but quietly sabotaging from within. You were in the prime of your adulthood now, granted far more agency than you could have ever imagined as a terrified 12-year-old. The empire might still stand, radiant and ruthless, but you had planted small cracks in its foundations through mercy, through protection, through memory. You only prayed that history would one day find those fissures and break them open wide. As you looked out your private window overlooking the Bosphorus, once so vast and frightening, you realized you no longer felt trapped. You felt ready. Ready for whatever came next in this empire of silk and shadows. Centuries have passed since your footsteps echoed along the marble corridors of Topkapi, yet the walls still stand silent, gleaming, immaculate. Today, tourists stroll through the palace with wide eyes, snapping photographs of delicate tilework, golden gates, and jeweled thrones. They marvel at the splendor of empire, the power of the sultans, the beauty of Islamic art, the sophistication of Ottoman administration. Guides speak proudly of education, diplomacy, architecture. They mention the Enderun School as a beacon of advancement, the world's first institutionalized gifted academy. They do not speak of you. They do not speak of the thousands of boys who arrived here in shaking carts and muddy ropes, stripped of names, faiths, families, and selves. They do not mention what you endured behind the brocade curtains and censored court records, the systematic breaking of children in the name of imperial grandeur. The old dormitory walls are still there, whitewashed and restored, but no one hears the muffled sobs once soaked into their stone. The music halls shimmer with restored instruments, but not with the memory of hands forced to play, so their captors might enjoy their suffering disguised as art. The kitchens, once alive with spice and cruelty, now serve as exhibits about Ottoman cuisine. Your story, and those of Dimitri, Stephanos, Nikos, Milos, Kasim, Elias, and countless others whose names were never recorded, has been reduced to a footnote beneath glass. A small placard reads, "The Palace School trained talented boys from various lands to serve the empire." Tourists nod approvingly, never realizing the price of that talent was innocence shattered and souls reshaped in agony. But just because history forgets does not mean memory disappears. You are still there, in spirit, a watchful ghost behind every gilded doorway, whispering your truth through cracks in the marble. The wind sweeping through the palace gardens still carries faint echoes of your mother's voice, screaming your name as they tore you away. The Bosphorus waves still crash in the distance, as they did on your first night inside prison disguised as paradise. You march still in those corridors, not out of obedience, but because your story demands to be witnessed, even if it cannot be told within the official narrative. If someone listens closely, very closely, they might feel that ache beneath the beauty, that sense of something terrible painted over with gold. They might sense that the Ottoman Empire, like all empires, rested on a foundation built not of stone, but of human suffering deliberately silenced. Yet even as the palace became museum, the system crumbled. The Devshirme ended. The Janissaries were dissolved. The world changed. But your legacy remains, not in the glory of conquests or architecture, but in the resilience you embodied. You survived and subverted. You became a protector in a place designed for predation, and although your body is now dust, your resistance lives on in every whisper of injustice shattered by compassion, in every child who refuses to be shaped into someone else's weapon. As visitors exit the palace, stepping back into the sunlight of a modern world, most will forget, but perhaps a few will pause, jolted by a feeling they cannot name, a sorrow, a chill in the heat, a sudden tightness in the throat. Without knowing why, they will understand something essential, that behind every shimmering empire, there are voices like yours, boys turned into ghosts who demand remembrance. And if they remember even for a moment, then you have won your final battle against oblivion.